Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say thanks to Johannes for the invitation to take part in this amazing event, and also to the outstanding team that makes things possible in the practical way, which are also very important. I think it's great for me to have been scheduled after lunch for talking about food. We are not hungry, and so we can use our brains to connect the ideas I want to present with former presentations about the scenarios, about after capitalism, about degrowth, and the new challenges it raises for economic geography, which is my specialty, as you know, or for more practical ideas as that of the boring solutions that I will come back to later. This is the roadmap or the outline I propose to all of you. First, a very short introduction about the politics and narratives of the Anthropocene, which will be useful for me for framing for food as potential food scenarios for the future. Thirdly, I will focus on the bioregional scenario that is performed, prefigured, and practiced by alternative food networks, which have been slightly mentioned earlier. And finally, which I think is the core of my presentation, we will discuss AFNs as prefigurative endeavors. What future are they dreaming of, and what are their nightmares and the fears they have about the future if their proposals are not finally achieved. But one preliminary question: is anyone in the room involved in urban community gardening, consumer cooperatives, cooperative supermarkets, direct selling or purchasing from producers, or any other form of alternative practice, say time banking, social currencies, co-housing? Is anyone, please? Okay, that's very good, because then you can challenge from an insider's perspective as well my developments about the mindset behind these alternative food networks and their bioregional scenario as well. We don't have only to rely on my perspective, but we can exchange ideas, which I think will be very useful. Well, starting point from this for this presentation is obviously criticism or concern about global food value chains, which are usually accused of unsustainability, long food miles, transportation costs, soil destruction, loss of biodiversity. They are also supposed to be unhealthy. They produce highly processed food items, which have a lot of chemical additives. They are unfair because it's big players, the big corporate power, either in agriculture, in food processing, in retailing, who take the lion's part of the economic value at the expense of small producers. Those chains are also supposed to deliver standardized, industrialized food, the same you can find the same food items in many different parts of the world. Of course, they are convenient. We have plenty of food available in our supermarkets. They are affordable. Food in our wealthy countries is more or less cheap, despite the recent pricing increases due to the inflation process, and available almost everywhere, despite the issue of food deserts and in the UK, in the US, which is an important issue, I know. And we finally enjoy a global assortment of food from everywhere, from all over the world, in our tables almost every day. Well, which are, with these ideas in mind, which are the four narratives for the politics and action in Anthropocene context can have been defined by a Spanish philosopher, José Manuel Cózar, which I think mostly fit with earlier discussions in this symposium. First, naturalism. Science, technology, and market-led solutions will be enough for leading a transition to a more sustainable society in the future, more or less in the logic of the so-called environmental economics. Taxes, prices, regulation can lead us to a different, to a more sustainable economy. Secondly, post-naturalism claims that nature does not exist any longer. Mankind has transformed nature to an extent that no aboriginal pristine nature exists. And as in your scenarios, technology will safely rule our future. Geoengineering, genetics, nuclear power, including transhumanism and other approaches. On the opposite, of course, eco-catastrophism, which have been discussed here in different shapes earlier, is very critical against naturalism and post-naturalism standpoints, and claims for an alternative, a new way of life to avoid the global collapse we have been instructed about before. And it's more attuned with ideas of degrowth or the ecological economics, which claims for a different way of measuring the economy, metabolism, and other very interesting issues there. And finally, for the eco-Marxist narrative, claims that for a new global political and economy to overcome the current situation of global capitalism is predatory of resources worldwide. This perspective combines not only the traditional concern of Marxism with social justice, but includes environmental justice and special justice as well. This, I go to my second point, these four scenarios may correspond to my broad proposal for four food scenarios. These narratives, correspond to the following food scenarios I will explain a little bit in the next minutes. First, naturalism could be equated with business as usual. Secondly, post-naturalism leads us to a tech food future. Eco-catastrophism claims for a bioregional arrangement of the food economy. I will go into more details later on. And finally, eco-Marxism opens the room for an eco-global food scenario made of bioregions interconnected. Well, I want to underline or emphasize that more or less these four scenarios would be suitable to be applied or to analyze different cases all over the world. But I will focus on Europe. I think that the departure point regarding food is so different across the world that we cannot elaborate on a single set of trajectories for a future. Then the first, I will go very briefly through this description of scenarios. The business as usual scenario relies on industry and technology to keep feeding the world in the coming future. Big food corporations will be able to develop new food items and new properties for food. They're actually selling in supermarkets, local food, animal welfare, respectful food, organic, seasonality, vegan. The system as is able to include more and more or attach more and more attributes to food. Labels, eco-labels, local labels, organic labels are the most common strategy for the corporate power to address every market niche, most of our individual concerns regarding food. And of course, a market-driven transition then is possible to a sustainable food system. And within the European context, it's important to take into account the role of state, the role of regulation. There's a strong political support regarding this topic in Europe, framed by the Common Agricultural Policy, Farm to Fork Strategy, for instance, and the European Green Deal. They, of course, put sustainability at the core of future policies in Europe regarding food and energy, but mostly frame or attach sustainability values to the core of the system, the food system, as it works actually. Secondly, tech food has been discussed earlier in different ways. Biotechnology, genetically modified organisms, 3D food printing, plant-based protein production, insects, algae will constitute the new horizon for feeding the world over. There will be, in this area, no food shortage because food production will become almost it's not possible at all, but almost decoupled from current environmental constraints. There will be, as a scenario, more in-lab and in-factory food production, transferred from the from rural areas and the land to factories, and then two potential implications important for economic geographers at least arise here. First, it might be expected the increase in the corporate power. Only huge corporations can afford for the huge investments in research and development connecting to this kind of food production. That can recruit the skilled labor necessary to turn food into an even more industrialized item, and can have the financial resources were mentioned before to invest in this direction. And elaborating more on these ideas, it's possible to forecast an even higher geographical concentration of this tech food production around cities, transferring not only production from land to factories, but those factories will be probably even more located are in developed regions and cities where agglomeration economies can arise, and those factories will benefit from those agglomerations economies required for people who work in research and development, skilled positions, and the like. But this scenario, and this, I think, an important issue, needs to pop up, to expand. It needs deep regulatory changes, in my view. Why? Because this implies, to some extent, a full new definition of what is food. Is it just proteins for our bodies, like those powder with water you mix and drink and you have it up, you feel fed? That's okay? Or are we still attached, or are we willing to attach cultural, social, historical, natural values and attributes to food? That seems a key question that should be sought out for this scenario to develop. Thirdly, the so-called bioregional scenario is highly contingent on the criticism I mentioned before. It, of course, rejects the two earlier ones and takes agroecology as the basis for a future food system. What is agroecology? We can discuss a little bit later on, not to delay my own presentation. Basically put, it relies on family farms as the cornerstone of the food system. Family farms, not large plantations, where traditional knowledge and practices rule food production, should be the cornerstone. They are diversified, not specialized, including different kinds of agriculture and cattle raising as well. They are supposed to be circular. Every resource produced in the farm is reintroduced in the production process. And of course, they want to maximize use of internal resources of any kind, and they want to minimize the introduction, the use of external input, either material or financial knowledge as well. Secondly, that food delivered through agroecological production units is marketed through short food supply chains. The bioregional scale is supposed to be an area able to provide water, food, and energy enough to sustain its population, is the mindset of these proposals of this bioregional scenario. Then a new way of connecting cities and rural areas is potentially emerging here. A coalition between rural actors who supply food and urban retailers and consumers who source from that environmentally friendly and locally produced food. The hallmark of this scenario are alternative food networks, which are then governed. The governance system is completely opposite as the other two scenarios. Small actors who cooperate in solidarity and democracy and which trust each other, as I will explain later. This scenario is not completely apart from regulation and from the state. And there are internal debates whether to cooperate with authorities in order to grow as for instance, we have the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which goes for this scenario, new forms of rural-urban cooperation and governance related to food. It's a growing network of cities all over the world. But some others who are, let's say, more radical in their ideas, in the mindset, want to keep apart from any form of state, of authority, of hierarchy, and of course market freedom and capitalism. Please don't take this scenario as a marginal thing and it's a not negligible one, because more people, as mentioned before by Greta, more people and more organizations are going for these ideas. FAO, Food Agricultural Organization, also backs agroecology as something to take into account in the future. And finally, I'm sure you are also wondering yourselves things like that, like those, how to feed mega cities in a bioregional scenario. Shanghai, 25 million, Paris, 13. With the bioregion, for that will be half of France. So this raises more questions than perhaps the answers it provides on how to replace World Trade Organization rules if we are going for more localized food supply system. Will be urban agriculture enough to feed cities in connection with those proximate producers or not? Full deglobalization, in the view of the eco-Marxist authors with this eco-global scenario, agree that full deglobalization of food seems currently unrealistic. Perhaps they say it's parochialist, only local, you don't care about distant people who are starving perhaps in Africa, or perhaps unsolidary with them. And bioregions then can hardly fit in this view densely populated territories in current dietary patterns in Europe and elsewhere, probably. So these people argument that the bioregional scenario is very nice. Those circular commons are so appealing, but they need a global governance agreement, how to exchange, how to communicate food across bioregions. And we need a new political economy and a new political ecology to reflect and to develop efficient, fair and sustainable food exchanges across bioregions in a very theoretical level. Of course, these 4 food scenarios, for Europe at least, are not excludable. But we will see overlappings. And in my view, it's likely to expect some form of convergence around the business as usual, due to the power of market and regulatory trends, actually. But as I mentioned before, tech food scenarios and bioregional ones will also have an influence. The extent to which is still to be defined. We have to take into account, for instance, that the power of the so-called big food or corporate food system is not equal all over Europe. The power of big supermarkets or the market share is larger in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe, for instance. We are more attached to local food, small groceries, and the like in Spain, Italy, or Greece, for sure, you know. Of course, the nature in Europe is not the same, that some regions produce a wider assortment of food than others. Settlement patterns are also influential in how to access to food. The big densely populated cities and scattered settlement patterns put people in more or less contact with the food producers, for instance. And of course, we have to be aware of socioeconomic differences, that how they influence dietary patterns. Wealthy people can afford are more conscious of the connection between food and health, for instance, and can afford for these different organic and eco and local labels, which are usually more expensive than food usually provided by the big players. So, in placing the future perspective of this symposium, most likely is there some regional diversity of food scenarios in Europe is foreseeable, which is something very interesting as a research topic for economic geographers, to be honest. Then I narrow the focus to the bioregional scenario, first on a more descriptive way what it is. Perhaps not everyone is familiar with alternative food networks, so I'm happy to see that some of you have some personal engagement. And then in the fourth part, I will go more deeper into how they imagine a fear of the future. First, alternative food networks, which I will define immediately, reject the commodification of food. They state that currently food are over-processed, mostly is harmful for our health and for nature. They also state that the whole food system is ruled by large firms that crowd out small stakeholders, and that to some extent this commodification of food decouples food and place. And we are fed by food from nowhere. Where does this come from? We don't know. And of course, they go for a de-commodification of food, and plainly put, they support the idea of marketing natural, sustainable, agroecological produced food items, marketed mostly by a small scale as actors at fair prices, and this is a topic to be discussed later on, what are fair prices and how to fix fair prices. And those food items should be on an ideal basis delivered within the limits of the bioregion, wherever they are, which is also always a matter of harsh discussion. So to turn food from nowhere into food from somewhere and somebody. Who is the producer? Who has what stages did this food go through from farm to my table? And then this way food becomes wrapped in a much richer and complex web of meanings and values beyond just its nutritional value. Okay. What in our project here, which is the project that frames this presentation, ALISOS, Alimentación Sostenible, Sustainable Feeding in Spanish. We have defined another definition of alternative food networks. There are too many. As forms of organizing the production, distribution, and consumption of food, and the coordination between these activities, which is a very important issue, whose principles and practices first promote a food system which respects nature and health, establish a more equitable distribution of the economic value along the value chain or among actors involved, try to minimize, to reduce the number of intermediaries, the ideal is direct selling from fruit to consumption, that operate mostly in conditions of geographical proximity to make face-to-face contact feasible and usual, and are ruled by participatory, inclusive, and democratic decision-making mechanisms based on mutual trust among the persons involved. Okay, here's a typology that I will not go into the many details. We have direct exchange, more horizontal, on-farm sales, farmers markets, eco-markets, community-supported agriculture. You have producer-driven AFNs, agricultural parks, online sales platforms, collective processing facilities, and people who produce a lot of tomatoes, many small farmers build up a small facility to turn the tomatoes into tomato sauce without losing the control on the process, and keeping value added internally. Consumer-driven one, which are most well-known, urban gardening, consumer groups, cooperative supermarkets, and also retail-driven possibilities as organic shops and food hubs, which are small warehouses where this kind of small-scale production is gathered, stored, and then sold, distributed to retailers, yes, to restaurants or to consumers. Well, but this small scale, and this is an important turning point in the presentation, this small scale alternative food networks have experienced problems to reach more individuals, more producers, and to make an impact in markets. And some people inside this alternative food arena go for upscaling the process and turning from informal activities. Most of these are non-legal entities registered anywhere. It's very difficult to screen them. say that we have to set up social firms, to set up cooperatives, to go to some form of specialization, from specialization to vertical integration of the alternative food process as well, to address emerging market opportunities like supplying organic shops, supplying vegan and local restaurants, and as a way to scale up the process. And there's an important issue here connected with the state regulation, which is that of the responsible food procurement. We need to raise up the size of these experiments to supply food to canteens at different schools, universities, hospitals, any kind of public organization. That's probably a very hot topic nowadays in this area. The power of our local and regional authorities to improve or to boost the regional scenario up. Well, then I have time enough to go into the last part. What are the dreams of people involved in these alternative food networks, and what are also their fears? I have been a bit surprised not to that anyone earlier mentioned the idea of prefiguration, which is commonplace in literature about the future and performing the future and building the future. I was afraid of being another prefigurative scholar more after 1 day and a half of presentation, but fortunately it was not the case. I'm not an expert on the field, but this idea comes every time I open a paper on these topics. You know that Box defined prefiguration as the embodiment with the ongoing political practice of a movement of those forms of social relation, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal. So it's performing or practicing the future in the present in a very simple way. Those alternative food networks then are prefiguring the bioregional scenario defined by the new political economy and ecology of food. My research background on AFNs comes from a long research involvement in social and economic innovation in rural areas and in the food industry for a long time. And my more recent focus on alternative economies by most of the research techniques that Christian mentioned before, and which are very demanding on a personal basis. Well, interviews, questionnaires, participant observation, as anthropologists recommend, regular attendance to first debates, assemblies, monitoring virtual spaces. They have blogs or website, Facebook groups. You have to be aware of discussions over there. And of course, documentary compilation as well. It's hard work to be, and your concerns about not being too close and how to approach from the academia, these alternative words are important methodological issues as well. Well, 3 core messages on my own. Alternative food networks as prefigurative practice. First, democratic politics. AFNs are not about food, about politics, mostly. The social innovation here, in my view, is that of the focus on direct democracy, on participation. Everyone is allowed to take part, is invited or encouraged to take part in assemblies, and consensus, not majority. Consensus is the rule of thumb for taking decisions. And there are long discussions until everyone agrees upon this. Work is mostly voluntary. There is no specialization, task rotation, no division of labor. That has some implications, but it is all supposed to empower individuals and the community as a whole, which is the main actor here, the community, not in the individual. Secondly, after the political, it comes the economic, an economy of the commons, of the commoning. The decommodification of food is also a political fact, but the food economy then becomes subordinated to democracy and community. Politics come first, and then the economy is supposed to be a tool, not a goal. Food, more or less, is deemed as commons, as a thing that should be withdrawn from pure market logics, not only as an opportunity to make profit or be dealt with as only pure private property. Then those empowered communities fueling these alternative food practices try to manage food through cooperation all among all actors in the value chain and fixing then fair prices for everyone. There are discussions, how much money are we willing to pay for these carrots in consumer goods, for instance. And once they set a price, if they have 3 carrots providers, all the carrots from each provider must be paid at the same price to avoid competition, for instance. This, of course, implies hours of debating. And then this way, economy, is deemed as a tool for the reproduction of life on Earth and not the opposite. Yes, I will skip. Okay. What are these bioregional geographies? I have taken too much time. Sorry. Then food commoning leads to territorial attachment and to ecological awareness. The bioregion is a nexus between democracy, community, and nature, somehow. And cities are the anchors of this bioregional scenario, to be honest. This is also a tricky topic as the geography of this. Because AFNs are mostly located in cities, mostly in large cities, not in medium and rural areas, as some we could talk not the bioregion or the city region. That's for geographies, that's very important. I will skip. This is a map of both 2 regions in Spain, Madrid, large metropolis, and the area in Castilla and León, where Salamanca is a rural area. And AFNs are located around cities, most of them, to supply consumers. Then my argument is that the politicization of food pretends to reshape societal priorities, democracy, and relocates economy as a tool and not as a goal. And such democratic governance of the economy is the logical consequences for this, leading to a resignification of such nature which provides food. But should, I will go quickly, AFNs scale up to develop a bioregional scenario, or are they small-scale operations able to replace the hegemony of the big food? And I come to the fears now. And these AFNs are facing 2 sets of problems, internal and external. Internal ones have been almost presented before. If you scale up, you have to adopt firm-like practices like delegation, hierarchies, specialization of work, how to set pricing, it's completely different. And then the economy regains the centrality, comes back to the core of the topic instead of being just a second tier issue. And also scaling up implies overflowing the bioregion. You cannot go for fish if you live in Madrid. So what's happening here? Then as AFNs quickly slip or slip to the conventionalization, they come like the conventional system they try to escape from. And there are also some external threats as well, because, as I mentioned before, big food players have depoliticized and refetishized organic, local, vegan through labels and brands. So now you can find healthy and local food affordable in most supermarkets at a convenient and available price. Then we don't need to engage in costly, demanding, demanding alternative food networks if you go to the supermarket. So capitalism then is being able to co-opt these societal demands regarding food, and so issues of regulation, taxation, and property also constrain the development of such bioregional scenario. My last word. According to this narrative of fear, then, the state capitalism nexus, in the view of alternative food practitioners, that should be clear, which are founded upon private property, taxation, and regulation, react upon the political meaning of AFNs. The promise of a future made of cooperation, commoning, commitment to nature, and attachment to regions, to bioregion, relies on an alternative political economy and ecology. But external and internal factors makes prefiguration very demanding in capitalist societies, in my humble view. So it seems likely that the bioregional food scenario will remain marginal, very small compared to the power of corporations and technology. And sorry for extending my presentation beyond time. Thank you.